The uncertain world of likely voters and polling error, methodological insights. Pre-election polls face a web of uncertainties at every step, from identifying who will vote to accounting for biases and error. The widely reported margin of error typically addresses just one factor, random sampling noise, while leaving many other sources of inaccuracy unmeasured. In lower turnout contests like primary elections, these uncertainties are amplified, and seemingly small errors can shift outcomes. In extreme cases, a combination of misjudged turnout, likely voter errors, and polling biases can even produce surprise results. For example, both top finishers in a top 2 primary coming from the same party, contrary to initial poll expectations. Below, we detail why a likely voter isn't necessarily a probable actual voter, and examine how sampling error, design effects, non-response, weighting, likely voter screens, and pollster-specific house effects contribute to polling uncertainty. We then show how these factors compound in primary elections and under top 2 systems. Non-digital. +1. Who counts? Likely voters versus probable voters. Pollsters distinguish between registered voters and likely voters, especially as elections approach. Registered voter polls include anyone on the voter rolls or self-identified as registered, whereas likely voter polls narrow the sample by screening respondents for turnout probability. Pollsters know that fewer people vote than say they will, so they attempt to estimate who will really show up. This may involve a likely voter screen, a series of questions on past voting, interest in the campaign, certainty of voting, etc., often combined into a score, e.g. a variant of the Perry Gallup Index. The pollster sets a cutoff score or screen to filter out those deemed unlikely to vote. For example, respondents who express only mild interest or a low self-rated chance of voting may be excluded from a likely voter sample. The goal is to approximate the probable electorate, i.e. actual voters, but this process inevitably involves guesswork. APR. JSTOR. A key challenge is that many people overstate their likelihood of voting, often out of a sense of civic duty or optimism. Surveys have shown that as many as 20 to 25% of those who say they'll definitely vote ultimately do not. For instance, in the 2016 U.S. Cooperative Congressional Election Study, 78% of respondents claimed they definitely would vote in the general election, but only about 64% of them were verified to have actually voted. This pattern of misreporting turnout intention means that a poll's initial likely voter list is imperfect. Some likely voters will stay home, and conversely some respondents dismissed as unlikely may end up casting ballots. Thus, likely voters, as defined by a poll, are not identical to probable voters, the eventual electorate. JSTOR. Beyond simple cutoff models, some experts advocate for probabilistic likely voter models. Instead of categorically including or excluding respondents, these models assign each person a vote propensity score, e.g. a probability from 0 to 1 of voting, based on predictors like past voting, interest, and demographics. All responses are then included but weighted by those propensities, effectively counting more probable voters more heavily. This approach, sometimes termed identifying probable voters, can reduce bias that arises from hard cutoffs, since it uses the full sample with graded weights instead of making an all-or-nothing judgment about each person. In practice, some polling organizations do use scaled turnout weights, but others stick to binary likely voter screening for simplicity. Different methods lead to subtle differences across pollsters in which voters count as likely. One reason polls may disagree. JSTOR. JSTOR. +1. Polling sample type definition and method effect on results. All adults, general population, includes all adults regardless of registration or voting likelihood, e.g. early polls or opinion surveys of the public. Captures broad public sentiment but includes many who won't vote. Often yields different candidate preferences, e.g., younger or less engaged people count more than the actual electorate. Registered voters respondents confirmed or self-reported as registered to vote. No screening for future turnout beyond being on voter rolls. more reflective of potential voters than all adults, but still includes apathetic or unlikely voters. Typically shows some differences from likely voter polls, especially early in a campaign when many registered voters may not participate. Likely voters, screen subset, respondents identified through one or more questions, vote intention, past voting, interest, etc., as highly likely to vote. Others are excluded from results. 3. https://aper.org/wp-content/uploads/2022/likely-voters-508.pdf tries to approximate the actual electorate by focusing on highly engaged, consistent voters. Tends to skew older and more politically engaged than the general population. 5. https://factually.co/fact-checks/politics/primary-polling-likely-voters-versus-explained-33f1 can significantly shift polling margins or candidate rankings compared to a full sample, depending on turnout assumptions. 5. https://factually.co/fact-checks/politics/california-polling-likely-voters-explained-33f1 probabilistic likely voters vote propensity model. All respondents receive an estimated turnout probability based on past behavior and other factors, and are weighted by that probability instead of a strict cutoff. 4. https://www.jstor.org/stable/269522236 maintains a larger sample while emphasizing likely voters. By including partial information from less likely voters with smaller weights, it can reduce some bias from misclassifying voters. Still reliant on assumptions, model quality, and not widely used in public polling. Considered an attempt to better capture probable voters' distribution. Inside a poll's margin of error, sampling and design effects. Every poll's estimates come with an inherent sampling error, the uncertainty from measuring a subset of the population rather than everyone. Pollsters typically report a margin of sampling error, often plus or minus 3 percentage points for 1,000 interviews, to quantify this uncertainty at a 95% confidence level. The margin of error shrinks as sample size increases. For example, doubling sample size from 1,000 to 4,000 roughly halves the margin from 3% to 1.5%, due to the square root relationship between sample size and standard error. Figure 1 below illustrates how adding respondents rapidly diminishes sampling error, but with diminishing returns beyond a few thousand cases. Biology insights. Figure 1. As sample size increases, the 95% confidence margin of sampling error, vertical axis, as plus or minus percent around a 50% result, declines. Polls typically involve 500 to 1,500 respondents, yielding 3.5% sampling error at 95% confidence. Large sample sizes beyond a couple thousand produce only marginal improvements in precision. Biology insights. Asterisk, however, the reported margin of error is only a best-case scenario. It assumes a perfect random sample with no systematic biases. In reality, modern polling uses complex designs and inevitably faces other errors that increase total uncertainty. Some key considerations. Biology insights. Design effects, weighting and clustering. Most surveys depart from pure simple random sampling. If a sample requires heavy weighing or uses cluster/stratified designs, the effective sample size is lower, enlarging the true margin of error. Even if a poll interviews 1,000 people, an uneven sample corrected with big weights might only provide the precision of a 700-person simple random sample. High-quality pollsters account for this by reporting an effective margin that incorporates design effects, but not all do, so some polls may appear more precise than they really are. Biology insights. Non-response and coverage bias. Today's polls face low response rates. Fewer than 4% of contacted people might complete a traditional telephone poll. When those who respond differ systematically from those who don't, non-response bias, error creeps in beyond what random sampling error would predict. If, for instance, highly engaged voters answer surveys at a higher rate than disengaged citizens, poll results will skew toward those engaged views, even after waiting. Coverage error is related. If the sampling frame misses segments of the population, say, a phone poll missing people without landlines or an online poll missing non-internet users, their views are unrepresented. Declining response rates and coverage gaps mean pollsters must rely on weighting and modeling to adjust for who is missing, a process that can itself introduce uncertainty. Non-digital. Biology insights. Question wording and measurement error. How questions are phrased and ordered can shape results regardless of sample. Leading or confusing wording and the order of questions can influence responses, an error source known as measurement error. For example, the inclusion or exclusion of certain candidates or issues in a survey prompt can change what respondents say. Pollsters strive for neutral, clear wording, but subtle wording choices can introduce bias that doesn't show up in the numeric margin of error. Biology insights. Likely voter screens and turnout assumptions. In addition to the challenge of sampling attitudes, election polls must also predict who will vote. This adds a layer of model error on top of sampling. Likely voter models involve assumptions about turnout that can materially shift poll results by several percentage points. For instance, switching from an all-registered voters readout to a tighter likely voter screen often moves the poll margin by 2 to 5 points in a typical election. The effect is larger earlier in the cycle, when commitment to vote is more volatile, and smaller as election day nears, when true likely voters are easier to identify. If a pollster misestimates turnout, for example, by expecting higher turnout than actually occurs, certain candidates' support may be overrepresented or underrepresented in their likely voter sample. In other words, the definition of likely voters itself can sway a poll's margins and even its predicted leaders. Non-digital. APER. Factually. Pollster House effects polling organizations vary in their methodologies, from how they weight demographics and past votes, to mode of interviewing, likely voter filtering, and treatment of undecided voters. These choices often produce consistent offsets, biases, for each pollster. For example, one firm's methods might consistently show a candidate's support a couple of points higher or lower than the average poll. These systematic differences are referred to as house effects, and they can persist across polls. House effects aren't necessarily intentional partisan bias. They often reflect differences in survey methods, such as how strictly turnout is screened, whether party affiliation is weighted, or how undecided voters are handled. Poll averaging can mitigate house effects by looking at trends across multiple pollsters, but if many polls share similar flawed assumptions, even an average of polls can miss in the same direction. Polling report. Polling report. +1. Key sources of polling error and their impact. We can summarize the main sources of polling uncertainty and how they can affect poll numbers. The directional risk of each source is context-dependent, i.e., it depends on which groups or candidates are affected, but all contribute to overall error margins exceeding the reported ±% from sampling alone. Error source, what it is, impact and risk. Sampling error, random error from surveying a sample instead of whole population. Wikipedia. Described by the margin of error, which shrinks as sample size grows. Wikipedia. Typical plus or minus 3 to 4% for 1,000-person poll at 95% confidence, symmetrical noise. Design affects loss of precision due to complex sample designs or heavy weighting. Biology insights. Inflates the true margin of error beyond simple random sample calculation, e.g., weights can make 1,000 cases act like 700, increasing MOE by 25%. Biology insights. Coverage error, some segments of the population are excluded from the sampling frame. Biology insights. Can bias results if excluded groups differ in preferences, e.g. polls missing younger or offline voters underrepresent their views. Non-response bias, some refuse to respond. Respondents differ from non-respondents. Biology insights. If certain demographics or partisans are less likely to respond, results tilt toward those who do. Likely voter model error uncertainty in predicting who will vote, miscalibration of turnout models. APER can skew results if turnout is higher/lower in some groups than expected, affecting candidate support by a few points or more. Non-digital. Question wording/order biased or leading wording, question sequence influences answers. Biology insights may push results in one direction, depending on context, without reflecting true opinions. House affects consistent pollster-specific tilt due to method differences. Polling report. One pollster's results might run a point or two higher or lower for certain candidates or parties systematically. Polling report. Low turnout primaries, compounded uncertainty, and top two surprises. Polling is even trickier in primary elections, where turnout tends to be dismally low, often only around 20 to 30% of eligible voters. This means primary polls must correctly guess a much smaller, self-selecting electorate than in a general election. Several factors heighten uncertainty in primaries. Bipartisan policy. Volatile turnout and enthusiasm. Primaries are highly sensitive to turnout fluctuations. The pool of voters is smaller and can swing widely depending on voter enthusiasm, campaign organization, and unpredictable events. Many voters skip primaries if they perceive less at stake or if they aren't strongly committed to a candidate or party. This makes likely voter screening even less certain. A small error in judging which subset of voters is motivated or in forecasting overall turnout can cause a large percentage swing in a poll's outcome. Bipartisan policy. Skewed electorate composition. In primaries, the voters who do turnout are often not demographically or politically average. They tend to be older, more partisan, and more habitual voters than those who stay home. For example, in one California primary, early returns showed voters over 65 were about 10 times more likely to have cast ballots than those under 35, implying older voters would make up roughly half of the electorate while young adults might comprise only 12%. A poll's likely voter model must anticipate these patterns. If the model underestimates the skew, for instance, expecting younger voters to participate at higher rates than they actually do, the poll can overstate the appeal of candidates favored by low turnout groups and misjudge who is actually in the lead. KCRA. +1. KCRA. Factually. Crowded fields and vote splitting, primaries, and especially *nonpartisan jungle primaries where all candidates compete together, such as California's top two system, often involve many candidates splitting votes. When combined with low turnout, even small differences within a poll's margin of error can reorder which candidates end up in first or second place. For instance, if one party's voters divide their support among multiple contenders while another party's voters rally around a single candidate, two candidates from the latter party could finish at the top. A potentially surprising outcome if polls did not foresee the degree of consolidation. In a top two primary system, the compounding of polling uncertainties can produce unexpected same-party general elections. California's experience illustrates this. Since adopting a top two primary in 2012, at least 8 general election races have seen both runoff finalists come from the same party in districts that otherwise were competitive or even leaned to the opposite party. Such outcomes, almost all Republican versus Republican pairings in a predominantly Democratic state, underscore how small polling misestimates of turnout or voter alignment can have outsized consequences under top two rules. In one high-profile scenario, the 2026 California gubernatorial primary, early polls indicated a fragmented field with no clear top two leaders, raising the possibility that two candidates from the minority party could capture both runoff slots despite the state's overall partisan balance, a result party leaders feared. While that scenario remained a long shot, it shows that when polls grapple with many candidates, tiny shifts within the margin of error, or slight biases in likely voter assumptions, might flip which two names ultimately emerge on top. Pick. +1. To sum up, polling for elections is as much an art of modeling turnout as it is a science of sampling. Likely voter polls represent pollsters' best guess at who will cast ballots, a guess that improves near Election Day but is never foolproof. Probable voters, in truth, can only be fully known after the election. Meanwhile, the official margin of error only captures sampling noise, while leaving out design complexities, non-response quirks, and other biases that are especially pronounced in the highly uncertain environment of primary elections. All these factors can align to cause polls, and even prediction markets, to miss unusual outcomes. Interpreting polls wisely means recognizing their limits, understanding how likely voter definitions, margins of error, and the many hidden errors can together shape, and sometimes mislead, expectations about election results. Ultimately, cautious analysts keep in mind that polls are estimates, useful for insight into electoral trends, but inherently subject to uncertainty and a range of plausible outcomes, especially when only a fraction of voters will decide who actually shows up on Election Day. APER. Biology Insights. +1.